Hey everybody, it's my birthday, and to celebrate, here's my review of Saints Row 4 for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. This is a third-person action game and the sequel to Saints Row the Third. It's also the conclusion of the Saints Row series, if Volition is to be believed. Interesting note about Volition, they started development on this thing under THQ as a publisher, and THQ eventually went under. So, Volition was acquired by Deep Silver and are now Deep Silver Volition, and the game was published under Deep Silver in August of this year. And it was met with a somewhat mixed reception, although most of the reviews seemed positive, and there were a lot of people who really enjoyed it. But then there were also a lot of people who really hated it. So the question there is, why did people hate it, and why did people like it? Why was there such a massive difference between the two? Well, before I answer that question, let's first talk about the presentation, which is kind of interesting because this does run in the same engine that powered Saints Row the Third, and despite being exclusive to DirectX 1011, you're really not going to see a huge difference in performance between the two games. Obviously, Saints Row 4 is going to run slightly worse because they did improve a lot of the DirectX 1011 features, which results in improved shaders, improved ambient occlusion, better particle effects, things like that. But it's nothing that's really game-changing as far as the visuals go. They're pretty much the same as they were in Saints Row the Third. In fact, there's a lot of asset reuse, which is not necessarily a bad thing considering how this game is actually set up. That said, the interesting thing about this game is that performance-wise, it's not very heavy on the graphics. You really do need to have at least a tri-core processor to be able to run this thing well. I'm running a dual-core, and as you can see in the video, it didn't really run all that well. It was playable, but if I had a slower dual-core, then it would have been a really big problem, because it just wouldn't have run well at all. You can run it on a dual-core. I really don't recommend it. I recommend at least a tri-core. I also recommend you really go for quad-core. But in this case, it's a very processor-intensive game. All open-world games are actually very processor-intensive. And so, you won't see a huge boost in upgrading your graphics card with this game. In fact, that's exactly what I did. When I swapped out my 8800 GT for this HD 6850 that I've got, I didn't see a really noticeable boost in performance, even though the HD 6850 is a more powerful card. And the simple reason for that was that my processor is really the problem here, because, it's not a tri- or a quad-core processor. Just something to keep in mind there. As for the rest of the presentation, the visuals do have a pretty unique art style going on for the most part, because most of the game takes place inside of the simulation of Steelport. And you will notice things in this simulation, sort of glitches in the Matrix. There's a lot of things like scan lines going along, there's signs that you would think would say one thing, but actually say things like obey. Lots of references to stuff like they live, which is great. But the actual visuals themselves really do drive the point home. It's, hey, this is a simulation, and there's a lot of glitches in the simulation. It's not perfectly coded, and that means that a lot of people are going to have visual glitches going on, particularly around rifts. But you'll see when you engage in certain mini-games that they'll actually have the glitchy characters running around, and they're all malformed, and that actually makes them kind of hard to really figure out where you're supposed to aim with those guys, but it's actually rather amusing. And the art style in general is rather amusing. It doesn't really take itself all that seriously, and so it ends up being fairly bright and colorful, and it actually really does fit the game very well. And plus, bright and colorful is always a good thing when you compare it to other games right now, which are all brown and gray and realistic. So, there is one thing that I don't like about the visuals, and that would be the sky. Inside the simulation, it is basically eternal night until you've actually completed the game and go into basically sandbox roam mode, in which case you can actually control what the day-night cycle for the simulation is. It just makes it a bit weird. ends up looking a lot like Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon as a result. But it's nothing particularly huge, it's just something that you kind of have to get used to. So what about the rest of the presentation, the sound design? Well, the voice acting in this game is pretty fantastic. They've got a very good cast, several of whom are reprising their roles from previous games. And as a result, they play their characters really well. They already know the characters, so obviously they're going to be able to play them. But the comedic timing and everything that these voice actors are able to do really does assist the game, because it is a very silly game, and if they weren't able to pull off all of the comedy stuff, it really wouldn't be that great. So it's kudos to them for really being good at this whole thing, and really adding a lot of personality to the game. The rest of the sound design is a bit of a mixed bag. The sound effects themselves are pretty much just serviceable, and that's about it. They're not great, they're not bad, they just kind of fit, and that's about it. There are some that are outright wimpy, like the replacement for the quick shot pistol. One of the skins for it is the Han Solo style blaster. And when you actually run around with these things, they make a very wimpy pew pew noise that you really don't expect these things to make. You expect them to sound really badass and powerful, and they don't. So that's a rather large disappointment. But most of the sounds fit pretty well, and there's actually quite a few that are reused from previous games too. But they do fit what they're attached to as well, so that works fine. And then there's the soundtrack, most of which is licensed, which is why you're not actually hearing it in this video. But there's a lot to be said for the just fantastic soundtrack in this game. Lots of great tracks, particularly on the classic rock station on the radio in this thing, which you can actually listen to while just running around in the game world, as opposed to being in cars and such like that. So the game ends up being rather amusing, particularly when you're running around slaughtering hordes and hordes and hordes of aliens to stuff like What is Love, or Don't Want to Miss a Thing, or La Donna Immobile. Just glorious moments with tracks like that. And they actually did bring back reggae in this one, so if you were missing out on reggae in the previous game, it's back. Enjoy it. So there's a lot of really great tracks in this thing, and they do fit the game very, very well. So you're probably going to find something to like about that soundtrack. So, with all of this rather solid presentation, how's the rest of the game? Because as you all know, what really matter are the story and the gameplay, and the story in this thing is completely bonkers. You once again play as the boss of the Saints, the same character you played in the previous 3 games in the series, and this time you have become the president. Why? Because that's the next logical step from the previous game, of course. Which is especially amusing because I played a female character in this thing who happened to be French. I actually kind of missed the crazy Russian lady voice that I had in the previous game, but oh well. So, it even makes fun of things like that. You even think I'm a legal candidate? Screw you! Just roll with it! And stuff like that. But the entire concept of this game is just completely absurd. You're the president, and suddenly Earth gets invaded by aliens. So what do? You try to fight back. You actually end up losing immediately, and these aliens, the Zin Empire, led by Zinyak, have taken over Earth, and you have been thrown into a simulation of your own personal hell, which is a 1950s sitcom. It's glorious, complete with pancake eating simulator. At any rate, the actual meat of the game takes place in a simulation of Steelport, which you get thrown into after you break out of the simulation of the 50s sitcom. And you're basically trying to gather all of your friends from the Saints and get them all together so you can fight back against Zinyak and break out of the simulation altogether, defeat the Zin Empire, win Earth back, that sort of thing. And I really don't want to spoil much of the storyline to you, because a lot of the really great stuff in this game is due to the writing. There's a lot of really, really great humor in this thing. Tons of references to tons of things. The entire intro sequence, for instance, is entitled Zero Saints 30. And even better than that, it's pretty much just a parody of Call of Duty. In fact, there's so many parodies in this thing, it kind of makes your head spin. It makes fun of just about everything it can make fun of. And that is one of the best parts of the game, actually. It's just, you go into this thing and you can't really take it seriously. It makes fun of just about everything. And if you're like me and you've played a lot of video games and you've seen a lot of movies and TV shows and stuff like that, you'll get most of the references. And you'll instantly chuckle at it because it's done in such a way that it makes perfect sense for it in the Saints Row universe. But at the same time, it's making fun of the actual source material. It's just done really, really well. And that's actually part of the problem that a lot of people have with it. A lot of people think that the game should have been like Saints Row 2 and Saints Row 1, where it was pretty much just a straight-up GTA clone with almost no humor in it whatsoever. I disagree, because that sort of thing is boring. This game is most certainly not boring, particularly because it is so amusing. And with all this amusing stuff and all these parodies and even references back to the previous games in the series, it feels like Saints Row 4 really establishes the Saints Row identity. Like, it acknowledges where the series has been, but it says, hey, this is where we are now. This is what Saints Row is. If you don't like that, well, sorry. But there actually is something in there for fans of the Saints Row series, so if you've played the previous games and you really like the previous games, you'll probably find something to like about this game as far as its writing and references and everything go. But how do all of these references and all this ridiculousness play out in the gameplay? Well, gameplay is actually pretty much what you'd expect from having played Saints Row the Third. There's still a lot of things to do. There's a lot of mini games. You still run around. You can drive all sorts of different cars, all sorts of different bikes, air vehicles, you name it. You can engage in all sorts of mini games, which can, a lot of these are actually taken from the previous games. And you're basically just there to have fun. There are also story missions available, and you will get money as you do all sorts of different things. Although in this game, the money has been replaced by cash. C-A-C-H-E, as opposed to C-A-S-H. And that's just a nomenclature difference, really. There's nothing particularly different about cash. And there's also a new resource added, which is clusters. And the clusters are what you use to upgrade your superpowers. Now, superpowers were a big deal with this thing. They made that very clear very early on that you get superpowers in this game, and it's awesome. Well, is it awesome? Yes. And it also completely changes the dynamic of play. They actually do take quite a bit of advantage of these superpowers, and they feel like a very natural part of the game, which you'd think would be kind of weird having played the previous games. But it's actually not. It does pretty much render driving and even flying vehicles obsolete, though. And even though they did have a lot of customization options with those vehicles and everything, it feels like they're just secondary. It's one of those things where if you want to run around on the ground and just drive vehicles and all that, you can certainly do that, but for the rest of us, they're superpowers. And there are 8 specific superpowers which are all unique, and there's sub-abilities within those. For instance, some of them have different elements that you can use, fire, ice, all sorts of different things like that. They each have their own upgrades for things like duration, range, damage, all sorts of different things like that. And some of them even have their own unique things, like the super sprinting upgrade. Eventually, you can basically run up walls, or you get an effect where it sends things that you're running into flying out of the way, and things like that. There's an ability for the jump, which will allow you to glide, which you basically fly. And that's actually going to be your primary method for getting around. You're going to be super sprinting and super jumping / gliding a lot. because it's just such a good way of getting around. You move around really fast as a result, and it really does take out a lot of the time that you would have spent just driving around. Which, if you ask me, is actually a really good thing, because that was the one thing I really hated about these games, and something I've always hated about open world games in general, is the downtime. Just driving from point A to point B. It takes forever. It does occasionally throw you into vehicles as part of missions or mini-games, like the Mech Mayhem and all that sort of thing. But for the most part, you're just allowed to run around with your superpowers, and that really does change the dynamic of play. It allows you to do superpower takedowns as well, which are just immensely satisfying. And with these superpowers, you feel like a total badass, on top of an already rather powerful arsenal available to you. So you feel like you have become Death the Destroyer of Worlds with this particular game, and actually I think that's one of the achievements. But it really is pretty much a power fantasy, and that wasn't really the vibe I got from the previous games, but in this particular case, it works out really well in the game's favor. Because it ends up just being, okay, let's mess around with the game now. And even when I'm not just running around sending things flying with telekinesis or freezing everything, and if there's a moving vehicle coming towards me, freeze it and then watch it just skid along because it's frozen and things like that. Even when I'm not doing all that, I found even just running around the city, finding all the data clusters fun. And that's something I never really got with Saints Row the Third or Saints Row 2. Finding all the collectibles wasn't really a big deal to me in those. Yet in this one, finding all that stuff, it felt like it was worth it, because you were finding all these clusters which you could use to upgrade all of your powers. Or you were finding text adventures. Yes, there are text adventures in this game. And they're just hilarious. Or you're finding audio clips that fill in some of the backstory that you didn't necessarily get from the actual way the story plays out. Things like that. It all just makes it a very coherent, very fun experience. There was only one thing in this game that I really, really didn't like. And that was the hacking minigame. Oh, that's annoying. It's just the pipes game, and I really don't like that game. I'm not big on puzzle games, so something like that in Saints Row just doesn't feel like it fits for me. But it wasn't that huge of a deal. It's just, it got really annoying when I had to do these sorts of things. It just kind of interrupted the action. I'm just like, eh. That said, for the vast majority of Saints Row 4, I had a lot of fun. I did notice some problems with it, though, that didn't really affect my enjoyment of the game, but I can see it affecting some people's enjoyment. You do get a lot of side quests which allow you to unlock various things, which is fine, but the problem with it is that it has you doing a bunch of mini-games. And these mini-games are just what you would normally do while running around doing mini-games in the game. If you just felt like doing mini-games, hey, I just want to do this one Mayhem mission, or this one Rift mission, or whatever. And I can see where people would just be like, whatever. But because of the rewards, it really does give you more incentive to actually play the minigames. And the minigames in this thing actually don't suck, which is more than you can say for a lot of minigames and a lot of games. The only one I really hated, the hacking minigame, was just there. Most of them were actually pretty fun. And there were some that were just kind of like the one where it had you collecting these floating orbs while running along a track, and occasionally you'd have to use the burst to get through the obstacles or jump over a pit or something like that. That one I wasn't really good at, so that was why it bothered me. But other than that, I really didn't have any trouble with the minigames in this thing, and they felt like a pretty natural part of the game. Because in this thing, you're basically doing what you can to disrupt the simulation, and that's exactly what you're doing with all of these minigames. And so, when it has you doing all these things for side quests, and you're just basically playing the game out, just playing it, it really doesn't present a problem. And if you don't want a particular upgrade, you don't have to go for that particular upgrade. That said, I do recommend you go on the loyalty missions. Just saying. But all that said, Saints Row 4 is not without problems. That much is very certain. It's a bit too easy at times. The minigames, while there is quite a bit of variety among them, even within specific points, like the rifts, for instance, the minigames do eventually get a bit repetitive. The game isn't quite as long as previous games in the series, even though there is a lot of content in them. And already they've shown that there's going to be a fairly big push for DLC, although a lot of it is just cosmetic DLC so far, which is fine, but even then, I'm not really one of those people who goes, ooh, DLC. I don't really like DLC all that much. It just feels like a shady business practice to me. Unless you're actually producing a full-on kind of expansion DLC, which is what they did with Enter the Dominatrix. But anyway, again, Saints Row 4 is not without problems. It has performance issues on dual-core processors, so if you're like me and you're running a dual-core, you'll run into problems with it. It has a lot of repetition. There's a lot of reused things. But at the end of the day, I found that none of these problems really overshadowed the amount of fun I was having with this game. It was just a blast to play. And the more I played it, the more I felt like it was trying as hard as it could to just make me have a good time. And that is precisely what it did. Is it perfect? No. By no means is it anywhere near perfect. Is it something I would recommend to everybody? Of course not. Is it something I would recommend to people who didn't like Saints Row 3 because it wasn't Saints Row-y enough for them, or it wasn't GTA enough for them, or whatever the argument is that you guys present? I definitely don't recommend it to you guys. But if you're just looking for something that is crazy and fun and just lets you romp through this open world and do pretty much whatever the hell you want, it's definitely the game for you. And if you liked Saints Row the Third, you'll probably like Saints Row 4. I feel like it's a better game, actually. That's why I give it a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching.